I'm ready. Okay.
You are listening to America's home for stadium news and information.
Stadiums USA Radio on Yahoo Sports Radio and yahoosportsradio.com.
Once again, with your ticket to the action,
here's Bill Hazen.
We think we're going to have a little fun this segment talking about a stadium, which is a stadium I know a little bit about. I've been there and I've described it. It is a memory today. Baltimore's Memorial Stadium, which was not only home for the Baltimore Orioles, but also, of course, for the old Baltimore Colts from years ago. It's a truly neighborhood ballpark. We're going to visit with Keith Eggener, a columnist for Places. This is a leading journal of contemporary architecture. He is the Marion Dean Ross Professor of Architectural History at the University of Oregon, and he visits with us via digital audio. Keith, where did your romance begin related to Baltimore's Memorial Stadium? I know you have a great fascination with this place.
Well, really, like so many things, it comes from a kind of peculiar place. My best friend in college was a diehard Orioles fan, and he got me excited about the Orioles back in the 80s, and so I kind of followed them along the way. And then at a certain point in my own career, I was casting about for a new direction in my research, and I got the idea for this larger project on intersections between modern architecture in America and the topic of death. And I wanted to look at that intersection in a variety of ways. And one way that really interested me was looking at buildings as, in effect, living things that have life cycles.
Yes.
Including the end of that life cycle, which is death. So I wanted to look at how buildings, in effect, die and how they're remembered. And Baltimore Memorial Stadium was just a place that I knew. It was it just seemed like an interesting story, and with terrific connections to the city and the neighborhood in which it stood. So, yeah, there you have it.
And the community did struggle with what to do with this park, didn't they? Because there was not a feeling at the end of its run of good riddance or anything like that. This was a very much beloved facility, particularly in that neighborhood.
Oh, sure. And, this is a common problem with historic buildings and with the preservation of buildings. What do you preserve, and which part of the past do you preserve? We certainly can't preserve everything, because then there wouldn't be any room to build anything new. And, we have new things to say as new generations come along and want to put their stamp on the landscape, especially with a big, expensive building like a stadium. Especially when it's become outmoded for contemporary purposes, it's really tough to justify it economically. And yet so many people have such strong attachments to the place, a place where they went as children, a place where, so many important memories were made.
Well, and one interesting aspect of this stadium, a lot of older generation ballparks looked at Comiskey Park in Chicago, for example. You could tell, because of the nature of how it was designed and built, that it was an older ballpark. Memorial Stadium had a sweeping sensation to it, Keith. It gave you almost a sense of putting a new generation ballpark or a newer generation ballpark into an older neighborhood. You had that kind of a blending of new and old, if you will. And I think that's kind of a unique space that Memorial Stadium sat in, literally almost by itself.
Yeah, I agree with you. The design coming in 1950, when it did, was clearly influenced by modern architecture in terms of the reinforced concrete structure and the kind of streamlined shapes. It was bigger than a lot of earlier stadiums, but not nearly so large as the stadiums that would come in the 60s and 70s, places like Three Rivers Stadium or the old Busch Stadium in St. Louis. Baltimore Memorial Stadium was a kind of a transitional stadium, architecturally speaking, between those old ballparks, as you say, like Fenway or Comiskey or Wrigley Field, and between the new super stadiums of the 60s and 70s, such as the ones I just mentioned.
Yes.
There wasn't really anything else quite like it in terms of its size and its character, its architectural form. It was really transitional.
Stadiums are not just about steel and mortar and everything else. They're also about hopes and dreams, and that is certainly evident in the stadium because of its modern design. Did that make it more difficult for the community to wrestle with what to do with this space than it would be for some earlier generation stadiums?
Well, I mean, I think, of course, every generation has its hopes and dreams, and that's one of the problems with outmoded stadiums, because the hopes and dreams that were bound up in a stadium like Baltimore were related to an earlier generation that was in the process of passing. This was a stadium built around 1950. Its glory days occurred, in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, but it was on the wane. It was outmoded. The Colts abandoned ship, and the Orioles really wanted out too. They hung on for a while longer, but they wanted out of the place as well. It was falling apart. It was too small. It didn't have the modern amenities. It was frankly not very good as a playing space or a watching space for football, even though it was regarded as very good for baseball. It just wasn't a very practical stadium anymore. So it had its connection to an older generation, but a new generation wanted a new kind of space.
Initially, if I remember correctly, this ballpark was really built more with a bend toward football than baseball, but it rapidly was reconfigured due to some minor league baseball success. How did Memorial Stadium work as a football stadium?
As a football stadium, it just wasn't very well configured for a viewing audience. Just the shape of it was geared toward the diamond, really. So it provided a really, terrific sort of perspective on the game for a baseball audience, but everyone was kind of crammed into one end of the field of play, during a football game. It just simply didn't work that well. You couldn't see a lot of the action.
What was the final resolution? What did they decide to do with this property?
When it came down, there was this compromise because, as you say, people had a hard time letting go of it. The stadium itself was no longer really viable. The teams had fled. There wasn't political support for it, or really all that much support for its preservation within the larger Baltimore community, as I understand it. I wasn't there at the time, but there was this compromise brokered whereby the memorial wall was preserved. Now, the memorial wall, for those who don't know the stadium, was this big, very kind of streamlined modern wall with this extraordinary stainless steel lettering designed by a guy named Francis Tarlowski that said Memorial Stadium, and it had a dedication written in these large stainless steel letters to the veterans, the soldiers who'd fought in World Wars I and II and the Korean War. And so the stadium, served as this memorial. So when it came down, there was an attempt to preserve that memorial wall, purely as a memorial, disconnected to a stadium. That didn't last very long. It just it ended up looking sort of like a defunct drive-in movie theater screen just out in a parking lot full of rubbish, and it was eventually taken down as well. I mean, it's interesting what became of the stadium. It was basically parted out. The letters, the stainless steel letters I was just referring to, went into storage. Cal Ripken got part of the letters, the ones that spelled out Memorial Stadium, and was going to erect them out at a youth ballpark facility that he was building out in elsewhere in Maryland, although they haven't been mounted yet, so far as I know. Part of the letters from the memorial wall, those which said the primary slogan, "Time will not dim the glory of their deeds." Those letters were moved to a new memorial that was set near Camden Yards that carried on this memorial tradition connected to the stadium. Pieces of the stadium, its seats, its lockers and things were sold at auction to fans who all wanted a piece of the history. Other parts of the stadium were ground up and turned into little memorial stadium replicas, made with pieces of the real fabric of the original stadium. And then the property itself, the real estate, was it was talked about being used for a number of different things. It eventually served as a centerpiece, a yard for a larger development, a senior citizens complex, a residential home a retirement home for senior citizens. And there was, basically places to walk and things out where the field had been. But more recently, that field has been turned back into a ballpark, a youth ballpark, where you can still play baseball on the original site, even if the stadium doesn't rise around you.
Keith, fascinating visit. We appreciate it. Continued success, and come on back and visit with us again.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Good day to you.
A real pleasure. Keith Eggener, our guest.